This is a work of pure fiction. Some of the stories and information you'll hear tonight have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. They are not intended to offend, harm, or misrepresent anyone. All characters and internal stories are fictional, crafted with care to create a chilling and immersive experience for you. If you enjoy this broadcast, please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Good evening, listeners. This is Martin Drake, broadcasting live from Station 817. If you're tuning in tonight, I urge you to pay close attention, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just news. It's the kind of story that could carve its way into history and haunt our world forever. It all began with a rumble, a vibration deep beneath the surface of our Earth. At first, it was dismissed as insignificant, a tremor too subtle to warrant much concern. After all, this land, sitting above one of nature's most ancient ticking time bombs, had always murmured its warnings in the form of minor quakes. But this time, something was different. The ground seemed restless, shifting more frequently. The vibrations felt deeper, darker, as though something monstrous was stirring beneath the crust. I first caught wind of it 3 days ago. A seismologist friend of mine, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, called me late one night, his voice trembling in a way I'd never heard before. He said, "Martin, I think we're seeing the beginning of something. The caldera, it's waking up." He didn't need to say which caldera. In this part of the country, there's only one that matters: Yellowstone. At first, I thought he was being dramatic. People have speculated about Yellowstone for decades, claiming every rumble was a sign of the apocalypse. But he insisted this wasn't speculation. He described how the ground near the caldera had risen, just a few inches, but enough to set off alarms in the scientific community. He spoke of harmonic tremors, a series of rhythmic seismic waves that often signal magma on the move. It was technical, heavy stuff, but his fear was palpable. He ended the call with a warning that still sends a chill down my spine. "Watch for the animals, Martin. They'll know before we do." The next morning, I started to notice the reports trickling in. Wildlife behaving strangely, fleeing the park in droves. Herds of bison stampeding across roads, birds abandoning their nests, even predators like wolves retreating from their territories. Tourists in Yellowstone posted videos online, confused and frightened by the sudden exodus of animals. Some joked about it, calling it a bison parade. But there was no humor in the way those animals moved, as though an invisible force was driving them away from their home. I decided to dig deeper. That same afternoon, I contacted a park ranger who had worked in Yellowstone for over 20 years. He told me he'd never seen anything like it. "The ground's been hot to the touch in some areas," he said, his voice strained with exhaustion. "Steam vents are opening up where they shouldn't be. Geysers that haven't erupted in decades are suddenly spewing water like clockwork." He hesitated before adding, "And the smell, Martin. It's like the earth is rotting." That night, I couldn't sleep. I found myself poring over research, reading every article, every study I could find about supervolcanoes. Did you know that the Yellowstone caldera, sitting quietly beneath one of the most picturesque landscapes in America, is essentially a ticking time bomb? Beneath its serene surface lies a reservoir of magma so vast it defies comprehension. Scientists estimate that the chamber holds thousands of cubic kilometers of molten rock and gas. If it were to erupt, well, let's just say it wouldn't be like any volcanic eruption we've seen in modern history. The following day, the news finally broke. Seismographs had detected a series of powerful tremors directly beneath the caldera, some reaching magnitudes that could no longer be ignored. The U.S. Geological Survey issued a Level 2 alert, which might not sound like much, but for a supervolcano, it's the equivalent of a blaring siren. Local authorities began quietly preparing evacuation plans, though they hadn't yet made them public. I remember thinking about the people living in the shadow of that sleeping giant, blissfully unaware that their world could change in an instant. Tonight, as I sit here speaking to you, I can't shake the feeling that we're standing on the edge of something far greater than any of us can comprehend. The air feels heavy, almost suffocating, as though the earth itself is holding its breath. The skies above Yellowstone have taken on an eerie hue, a grayish-yellow tint that seems to stain the horizon. Scientists are still analyzing the data, trying to determine if this is the precursor to an eruption or just another false alarm. But deep down, I think we all know the truth. You don't need a degree in geology to sense that something ancient and unstoppable is stirring beneath our feet. As I speak, reports are coming in from locals near the park. One caller, a truck driver who passed through the area earlier today, described the roads as empty, like a ghost town. He said he saw entire families packing their cars, their faces pale with fear. Another caller, a rancher from Montana, said his livestock had started behaving erratically, refusing to eat or drink. It's like they know something we don't, he said. And then there are the stories, chilling, almost surreal accounts from those who've spent years living near Yellowstone. One woman claimed to have heard a low, unearthly rumble emanating from the ground, so deep it seemed to vibrate through her bones. Another man described waking up to find his windows fogged over with condensation, the glass hot to the touch despite the cold winter air. It's hard to put into words, but there's a growing sense of dread, a feeling that we're standing on the precipice of something far beyond our control. And yet, life continues, as it always does. People go to work, kids go to school, and the world keeps turning, oblivious to the monster that lies just beneath the surface. Before I sign off tonight, I want to leave you with this thought. We live on a planet that's constantly in motion, a planet shaped by forces so vast and ancient, they're almost incomprehensible. Yellowstone erupted long before humans ever set foot on this earth, and it will erupt again whether we're ready or not. The question isn't if, it's when. And as I sit here, broadcasting to you from the safety of this little room, I can't help but wonder, when that moment comes, will we be able to do anything at all? Or will we simply be witnesses to the power of a world that doesn't belong to us? This is Martin Drake, signing off for now. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and keep listening. This is Martin Drake, broadcasting live from Station 817. If you're hearing my voice, it means you're still here, still clinging to this fragile thread we call life. But tonight, I'm afraid the thread has started to fray. Yellowstone has awakened. It's no longer a matter of if or when, it's happening. And the world as we know it is beginning to change. The first sign wasn't the eruption itself, but the sound, a deep, guttural roar that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. I wasn't there to hear it in person, but a listener called in, her voice shaking so badly she could barely get the words out. She was driving along a remote stretch of road near the park when it happened. It was like the earth was screaming, she said. I had to pull over because I thought my car was going to flip over from the vibrations. She described how the sky seemed to ripple, as though the atmosphere itself was being torn apart by the force of the sound. Within minutes, reports began flooding in. Witnesses described a massive plume of ash and smoke rising into the sky, a dark churning column that seemed to devour the sunlight. Some said it looked like a storm cloud, but darker, denser, and far more sinister. Others compared it to a nuclear explosion, the kind you see in old war footage, only this wasn't a man-made catastrophe. This was something far older, far more primal. The first eruption wasn't the cataclysmic explosion people feared. It was more like a violent exhale, a warning shot from the depths of the earth. Geysers erupted with ferocity, shooting scalding water and steam hundreds of feet into the air. Fissures tore through the ground, spewing molten rock and ash. The earth buckled and cracked, releasing plumes of sulfurous gas that choked the air and burned the lungs. Scientists are calling it a phreatic eruption, a type of explosion caused by the rapid heating of water trapped beneath the surface. When the magma below Yellowstone surged upward, it superheated underground water reservoirs, causing them to boil violently. The pressure became too much, and the ground gave way, releasing a torrent of steam, ash, and debris. It wasn't the full force of the supervolcano, not yet, but it was enough to send shockwaves across the region, both literal and figurative. I've been glued to the news feeds all day, trying to piece together what's happening. Satellite images show a massive plume stretching miles into the sky, carried eastward by strong winds. Ashfall has already been reported in towns as far as 200 miles from the caldera. People are posting videos online, showing streets blanketed in a fine gray powder. It looks almost like snow, but it's far more dangerous. Ash from volcanic eruptions isn't soft or harmless. It's abrasive, filled with microscopic shards of glass and rock that can shred lungs and destroy machinery. The worst part is how fast everything is happening. In the span of just a few hours, entire communities have been plunged into chaos. Roads are clogged with cars as people try to flee, their headlights cutting through the ash-filled air like ghostly beams. Emergency services are overwhelmed, struggling to coordinate evacuations while dealing with power outages and communication failures. Airports across the region have shut down, their runways buried under layers of ash. Even the air itself has become a weapon, filled with toxic gases that make every breath a gamble. And then there are the stories, the ones that haunt me even as I sit here safe behind this microphone. A firefighter called in earlier, his voice raw and broken. He described how his team was sent to rescue a family trapped in their home near the park. By the time they arrived, the house was half buried in ash. They managed to pull out the parents and their youngest child, but the eldest, a boy no older than 10, was nowhere to be found. They searched until their oxygen tanks ran low, but the ashfall was so thick they could barely see their own hands in front of their faces. The firefighter broke down mid-call, saying, "We had to leave him, Martin. We had to leave him." Another caller, a park ranger who had stayed behind to monitor the situation, described the moment the eruption began. It was like the ground just split open, he said. There was this wall of heat and sound, and then everything went black. I could feel the ash hitting my skin, burning like tiny shards of glass. I don't know how I made it out. He's now sheltering in a makeshift evacuation center, surrounded by families clutching what little they could carry. The scenes coming out of Yellowstone are apocalyptic. Entire forests have been reduced to smoldering wastelands, their trees stripped bare and blackened by the intense heat. Rivers have turned into boiling streams, their waters choked with ash and debris. Wildlife carcasses litter the ground, their bodies frozen in grotesque poses as if they were fleeing some unseen terror. I keep thinking about the people who didn't make it out in time, those who chose to stay behind or had no choice at all. What must it be like to watch your world crumble around you, to see the sky turn black and the air turn toxic, to feel the ground beneath your feet shake and splinter? One caller described it as watching the end of the world. Another simply said, "It's hell, Martin. It's hell." The eruption is far from over. Geologists are warning that this initial explosion could be just the beginning. The magma chamber beneath Yellowstone is massive, and the pressure building inside it is almost unfathomable. If it ruptures completely, the consequences would be catastrophic. An eruption that could blanket half the continent in ash, disrupt global weather patterns, and plunge the world into a volcanic winter. As I sit here, narrating these events to you, I can feel the weight of it all pressing down on me. The air in the studio feels heavy, stifling, as though the tension in the world outside has seeped into this room. My producer just handed me a note, another update from the field. It says that the ash plume has reached the upper atmosphere, where it's beginning to block out sunlight. Temperatures in the affected areas are already dropping, and scientists predict they could fall even further in the coming days. my listeners out there, those of you who are still tuning in, still holding on, I want you to know that you're not alone. We're in this together, facing something that no amount of preparation could have truly readied us for. But I need you to stay vigilant. If you're in an area affected by the ashfall, stay indoors, seal your windows, and avoid breathing the air outside. If you've been told to evacuate, do so immediately. And above all, don't lose hope. This is Martin Drake broadcasting live from Station 817. I'll be here as long as I can, bringing you updates, stories, and whatever comfort I can offer. Stay safe, my friends. Stay strong. The worst may still be yet to come. This is Martin Drake, still here with you, still holding on to the airwaves, hoping they're reaching you wherever you are. If you're tuning in, it means you've made it through the first strike. Yellowstone roared to life, and now we're standing on the precipice, looking down into the abyss. The eruption was just the start. The real horror lies in what comes after. What we're seeing now, my friends, is the beginning of the aftermath, and it's worse than I could have imagined. The ashfall hasn't stopped. Outside my studio, the world is cloaked in a grim gray shroud. It's everywhere, on the streets, on the rooftops, even in the air. Every time I step outside, I can taste it, a bitter, acrid flavor that clings to the back of my throat. It scratches at my lungs, making every breath feel like I'm inhaling sandpaper. I'm lucky though. I have masks and an air filter running constantly in the studio. Many people don't. Listeners have been calling in nonstop, their voices raw with fear and exhaustion. One man from Cody, Wyoming described how his town has been buried under nearly a foot of ash. It's like snow, he said, but heavier, deadlier. It collapses roofs, clogs engines, and makes it impossible to see more than a few feet in front of you. And the smell, God, the smell. It's like rotten eggs and burnt metal. The sulfur dioxide in the air is rising to dangerous levels. For those unfamiliar, sulfur dioxide is one of the toxic gases released during a volcanic eruption. It reacts with the moisture in the atmosphere to form sulfuric acid, which falls back to Earth as acid rain. That's what's happening now. Reports are coming in from Montana, Idaho, and even as far as South Dakota. Acid rain eating away at crops, corroding metal, and turning rivers and lakes into caustic death traps. I spoke to a farmer earlier today. His voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. He described watching his fields, his livelihood, wither and die in a matter of hours. The rain just melted everything, he said. The crops, the fences, even the paint on my tractor, it's all gone. I don't know what I'm gonna do. I didn't have the heart to tell him that this is just the beginning, that the ash and acid rain will make the soil infertile for years, maybe decades. The human toll is staggering. Emergency shelters are overflowing, their halls filled with coughing, crying, and the shuffling footsteps of the displaced. Hospitals are running out of supplies, masks, oxygen tanks, even basic first aid materials. I heard from a nurse in Bozeman who described the chaos in her ER. We've got people coming in with burns, respiratory issues, even broken bones from buildings collapsing under the weight of the ash. We're doing our best, but it's not enough. We're running out of room, out of supplies, out of hope. The power grid in the affected areas is failing. Ash is clogging the cooling systems of power plants, causing them to overheat and shut down. Transmission lines are sagging and snapping under the weight of the ash. Entire towns are plunging into darkness, their residents left to huddle in cold, damp shelters lit only by the flicker of candles and flashlights. Without power, people can't charge their phones, can't stay connected, can't even boil water to make it safe to drink. And then there are the fires. The intense heat of the initial eruption ignited wildfires that are now spreading uncontrollably, fueled by the dry, brittle vegetation and the winds carrying the ash. I got a call from a firefighter in Idaho who described the scene as hell on earth. He He said they're fighting blind. The ash falls so thick it's like trying to put out flames in the middle of a snowstorm. They're running out of water, out of manpower, out of time. The psychological toll is just as devastating. People are panicking, desperate to escape the nightmare unfolding around them. Roads are choked with traffic, cars barely moving as ash clogs engines and reduces visibility to near zero. I've heard reports of fights breaking out at gas stations, grocery stores, even evacuation centers. Desperation is turning neighbor against neighbor, friend against friend. One listener called in from a small town on the outskirts of the evacuation zone. Her voice was shaking, but not with fear, with anger. She described how a group of strangers showed up at her home, demanding food and shelter. When she refused, they broke down her door and took what they wanted. They left us with nothing, she said. No food, no water, just nothing. I keep thinking about the children. What must it be like for them, watching their parents scramble to keep them safe, seeing their world crumble around them? I got a call from a mother in Billings who described how her 6-year-old daughter hasn't spoken a word since the eruption began. She just stares out the window, she said, like she's waiting for something. I don't know how to help her. The broader impacts are starting to unfold too. Flights across the country have been grounded, the ash posing a deadly threat to aircraft engines. Supply chains are breaking down, leaving shelves empty and people scrambling for basic necessities. Economists are already warning of a global recession, the eruption disrupting trade routes and driving up the cost of food, fuel, and everything in between. And then there's the weather. The ash in the atmosphere is beginning to block out the sun, causing temperatures to plummet. Scientists are calling it a volcanic winter, a phenomenon where the particles in the air reflect sunlight back into space, cooling the Earth's surface. It's already started snowing in parts of Montana and Wyoming, an eerie, unnatural snow mixed with ash, turning everything into a desolate gray wasteland. I wish I could tell you it's going to get better, that this is the worst of it. But the truth is, we're only at the beginning. The pressure beneath Yellowstone is still building, and geologists warn that a second, larger eruption could be imminent. If that happens, well, I don't even want to think about it. For now, all I can do is keep talking, keep broadcasting, keep reaching out to you, my listeners, my lifeline. If you're out there, if you're hearing this, please take care of yourselves. Stay indoors if you can, wear a mask if you have to go outside, and don't drink any water that hasn't been tested or boiled. Check on your neighbors, your friends, your family. We're all we have left. This is Martin Drake broadcasting live from Station 817. I'll be here as long as the power holds out, as long as my voice can carry over the airwaves. Stay with me, stay strong, and remember, you're not alone. We'll face this together, one day at a time. Good evening, or whatever time it happens to be wherever you're listening. This is Martin Drake, your voice in the darkness, broadcasting live from Station 817. If you've made it this far, I don't have to tell you how much the world has changed. But tonight, I need to talk about the sky. The sky that was once blue and boundless, but now feels like it's pressing down on us with an eerie, suffocating weight. The ash cloud. It's spreading faster than anyone could have imagined, swallowing towns, cities, and entire regions in its relentless advance. This is no longer just Yellowstone's tragedy. It's becoming the world's nightmare. The ash cloud is a living thing, a monstrous, unrelenting wave that stretches as far as the eye can see. From my studio window, I can barely make out the skeletal outlines of the mountains that once framed this town. They're cloaked in a dense, gray haze that blurs the horizon and turns day into perpetual twilight. The sun hasn't been visible in days, and even at noon, the light that filters through the ash is weak, sickly, and unnatural. It feels like the world has been plunged into an eternal dusk, a haunting prelude to something worse. The ash isn't just falling locally anymore. Reports are coming in from states hundreds of miles away. Colorado, Nebraska, Kansas, places far beyond the immediate blast zone are now choking under a thick layer of volcanic fallout. Air traffic is at a standstill, with major airports like Denver and Chicago reporting visibility so poor that planes can't take off or land. Highways are becoming impassable as ash clogs engines, turning once bustling interstates into graveyards of abandoned vehicles. One of my listeners, a truck driver named Al, called in from somewhere along I-90 in South Dakota. He said he'd been stuck there for nearly 12 hours, his truck's engine choked to death by the ash. It's like driving through a snowstorm, but worse, he told me. You can't see more than a few feet ahead, and the ash gets into everything. I can't even run the heat in the cab because it pulls in air from outside. It's freezing, and there's no end in sight. Freezing. Yes, that's another cruel twist of this disaster. The ash cloud is acting like a blanket, trapping heat near the surface during the initial stages. But as it spreads and lingers, it's beginning to block out the sun's energy, cooling the Earth's surface at an alarming rate. The temperature here in Montana has already dropped by 10 degrees since the eruption, and forecasters are warning that this is just the beginning of what they're calling a volcanic winter. The ash itself is unlike anything most of us have ever encountered. It's not soft or fluffy like snow. It's abrasive, heavy, and insidious. It seeps into every crack and crevice, clogging machinery, contaminating water supplies, and even weighing down roofs until they collapse. A family from Casper, Wyoming called in earlier today, describing how their home gave way under the relentless weight of the ash. We were sitting in the living room, the father said, his voice trembling, and then we heard this groan like the house was crying. The next thing we knew, the ceiling came down. We barely got out in time. The health effects are equally devastating. Volcanic ash is composed of tiny, jagged particles of rock and glass, and when inhaled, it can cause severe respiratory issues. Hospitals are overwhelmed with cases of volcanic lung, a condition that feels like drowning in your own breath. Children, the elderly, and those with pre-existing conditions are especially vulnerable. I spoke with a nurse in Denver who described patients lining the hallways, their faces pale and their breathing labored. We're out of ventilators, she told me, and the masks we have aren't enough to filter out the ash. People are dying because they can't breathe, and there's nothing we can do. And then there's the psychological toll, the constant darkness, the unrelenting ashfall, and the eerie silence that comes with it. It's driving people to the brink. One listener from Rapid City described how the ash has muffled all sound, creating an oppressive stillness that makes every creak, every whisper, feel deafening. It's like the world is holding its breath, she said. It's terrifying. Farmers are watching their livelihoods vanish before their eyes. Crops that weren't destroyed by the initial acid rain are now being suffocated under layers of ash. Livestock are dying in droves, their lungs clogged with the same toxic particles that are killing people. I received a heartbreaking call from a rancher in Nebraska who described finding his cattle lying motionless in the fields, their once vibrant eyes now dull and lifeless. They were like family, he said, his voice cracking, and now they're gone. The economic impacts are rippling outward like shockwaves. Food prices are skyrocketing as supply chains collapse, and fuel is becoming increasingly scarce. Grocery stores in unaffected areas are seeing panic buying on a scale we haven't witnessed since the early days of the pandemic. One woman in Minneapolis described shelves stripped bare, fights breaking out over the last loaf of bread, and people hoarding whatever they can get their hands on. But it's not just the United States that's feeling the effects. The ash cloud is now reaching Canada, blanketing parts of Alberta and Saskatchewan in a gray, suffocating layer. Flights across the Atlantic are being canceled, and European meteorologists are warning that the ash could reach their shores within weeks. This isn't just our disaster anymore. It's becoming a global crisis. I've been trying to stay strong for all of you, my listeners, but I'll admit it's hard. The weight of it all feels unbearable at times. I look out the window of my studio and see a world that's unrecognizable, a world that feels like it's been ripped straight out of a nightmare. And yet I know I can't stop. You're counting on me to be your voice, your connection to the outside world. So here's what I can tell you. Stay indoors as much as possible. If you have to go outside, wear a mask, preferably one rated to filter out fine particles. Keep your windows and doors sealed, and don't use your air conditioning unless you're sure it has a high-quality filter. Avoid drinking water that hasn't been tested or boiled, and try to ration your food and supplies. This is Martin Drake, broadcasting live from the heart of the Ashfall. I'll be here as long as I can to bring you updates, stories, and whatever hope I can muster. Stay with me, stay safe, and remember, you're not alone in this. We're all in it together, one breath at a time, under a sky that refuses to clear. This is Martin Drake, coming to you live from station 817, though at this point, I wonder if live is the right word anymore. The air is thick, the ground trembles at random intervals, and every breath feels like a gamble. Tonight I need to tell you about something far more terrifying than ash clouds or falling rocks. I need to tell you about the pyroclastic flows, rivers of fire, death, and destruction that have no equal. These are not just natural disasters, they're the stuff of nightmares. And they've begun their rampage, carving a path of annihilation across what's left of the Yellowstone region. The first reports of pyroclastic flows came in late last night. It started in the heart of the caldera, where the ground had been reduced to a hellish landscape of molten rock and blackened earth. Witnesses described a sudden roar, like a freight train barreling through a tunnel, followed by a wall of heat so intense it burned the skin of those who were miles away. A park ranger, one of the few remaining in the area, called in from a satellite phone. His voice was raw with panic, his words barely coherent. "It's like the ground exploded," he said. "A cloud of fire and ash just poured down the slopes. It's moving so fast, nothing can outrun it. Nothing." Pyroclastic flows are unlike anything most of us can imagine. They're a lethal combination of superheated gases, volcanic ash, and rock fragments that cascade down the slopes of a volcano at speeds of up to 400 miles per hour. Temperatures inside these flows can reach over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to incinerate anything in their path within seconds. Buildings, trees, vehicles, even people, nothing is spared. I spoke with a geologist earlier today, one of the few experts who hasn't fled the region entirely. She explained that pyroclastic flows are essentially avalanches of volcanic material, driven by gravity and the immense pressure of the eruption. "Think of it as a river," she said, "but instead of water, it's made of fire and debris. And it doesn't stop until everything in its path is obliterated." The devastation these flows are causing is almost impossible to comprehend. Towns that survived the initial blast and ashfall are now being wiped off the map. Cody, Wyoming, a place I once visited on a road trip, is gone. The entire town was swallowed in minutes, its streets, homes, and people buried under a layer of burning ash and rubble. One survivor managed to call in before his signal was lost. "It came out of nowhere," he said. "One minute we were trying to clear the ash from our roofs, and the next the whole sky turned orange. There was this sound, like the earth was screaming. We barely made it to the shelter. I don't know if anyone else did. The speed of these flows is what makes them so deadly. Unlike lava, which moves slowly enough for most people to outrun, pyroclastic flows give no warning and no chance of escape. They surge down slopes, flowing around obstacles and filling valleys with searing heat and choking ash. Even the air ahead of the flow becomes unbreathable, filled with toxic gases that can kill long before the flow itself arrives. One of the most chilling accounts came from a drone operator who's been monitoring the eruption from a safe distance. He described watching a pyroclastic flow descend on a small community near the edge of the caldera. It was like watching a tidal wave, but it was fire instead of water, he said. You could see people running, cars trying to drive away, but it was too fast. It just consumed everything. The emotional toll of these stories is almost unbearable. A family from Bozeman called in earlier tonight. They'd been forced to leave everything behind, fleeing south with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The father, his voice breaking, told me about their narrow escape. We saw it coming over the ridge, he said. This huge, glowing cloud, like the world was ending. My kids were screaming. We didn't have time to grab anything. We just ran. I don't even know if our house is still standing. But it's not just the immediate destruction that's so horrifying. Pyroclastic flows leave behind a landscape that's uninhabitable for decades, if not centuries. The ground is covered in thick layers of ash and debris, burying everything that once stood there. The heat lingers, making it impossible to rebuild or even approach the area. It's as if the Earth itself has decided to erase these places from existence. The secondary effects are just as catastrophic. Rivers and lakes are becoming clogged with volcanic material, causing widespread flooding as water has nowhere to go. Reservoirs are being contaminated, leaving entire regions without a clean water supply. I've received reports of fish dying en masse, their lifeless bodies floating to the surface of once pristine lakes. Farmers are watching helplessly as their fields are buried under layers of ash, their crops destroyed, and their livestock dying from heat and suffocation. And then there's the human toll. Hospitals are overwhelmed with burn victims, many of whom won't survive their injuries. Rescue teams are risking their lives to search for survivors in the affected areas, but the conditions are so dangerous that many are forced to turn back. The death toll is climbing by the hour, and officials are warning that it could reach into the tens of thousands before this is over. As I sit here in my studio, safe for now but acutely aware of how quickly that could change, I can't help but feel a deep sense of helplessness. The world outside is unrecognizable, a wasteland of ash fire and death, and yet I know I have to keep going. For those of you listening, for those who still have hope, I'll be here, bringing you the stories of this disaster as they unfold. This is Martin Drake, your voice in the darkness, signing off for now. Stay safe, stay strong, and remember, you're not alone in this. We're all facing the fire together. This is Martin Drake, still here, still broadcasting, though I'll admit, each hour feels heavier than the last. Tonight, we turn our attention outward, beyond Yellowstone, beyond the immediate devastation, to understand the full scope of this event. The truth, my dear listeners, is that the Yellowstone eruption is no longer just a local or even national catastrophe. It's global, and its impacts are reaching far beyond what most of us dared to imagine. The Earth itself is groaning under the weight of this disaster, and the ripples are spreading, touching every corner of the globe. The ash, my friends, is everywhere. Massive volcanic eruptions like this one don't confine themselves to their source. The atmosphere becomes their playground, and Yellowstone has proven to be an aggressive player. The volcanic ash ejected into the sky has formed a dense, suffocating cloud, circling the globe with terrifying speed. What started as localized darkness has now evolved into a planetary veil, blotting out the sun across vast regions. Satellite imagery shows the ash cloud moving eastward, spreading over the Midwest, then the East Coast, before crossing the Atlantic. Europe is beginning to feel its effects now. Gray skies, cooler temperatures, and a sense of dread creeping into the hearts of millions. Flights have been grounded across North America and parts of Europe. Airports have become chaotic shelters for stranded travelers, their plans reduced to distant memories as the skies remain choked with ash. Aviation experts tell me that the ash is no minor inconvenience. Volcanic ash isn't like the soot from a fire. It's made of tiny, jagged particles of rock and glass. When it gets into an aircraft engine, it can cause catastrophic damage, melting into a glassy coating that can shut the engine down mid-flight. Planes simply cannot fly through this. And so the world's skies have fallen silent, adding an eerie stillness to an already unnerving disaster. But the skies are only part of the story. The global temperature is beginning to drop. Scientists are calling it a volcanic winter, a period of prolonged cooling caused by the massive amounts of sulfur dioxide released into the atmosphere. This gas forms tiny droplets of sulfuric acid, which reflect sunlight back into space. The result, a significant reduction in global temperatures, affecting weather patterns and ecosystems worldwide. Already, the effects are being felt. Crops in the United States are failing as ash settles on fields, suffocating plants and poisoning the soil. Farmers are watching their livelihoods vanish before their eyes, their once vibrant fields now barren wastelands. Wheat, corn, soybeans, staples of the global food supply, are in peril, and the ripple effects are spreading fast. I received a call earlier from a farmer in Kansas. His voice was hollow, defeated. "We've lost everything," he said. "The ash, it's like cement. It sticks to everything, and there's no way to get rid of it. We can't plant, we can't harvest. The animals are dying. I don't know how we're supposed to survive this." The global food crisis is escalating. Countries that rely on imports are scrambling to secure what little remains, but the supply chain is collapsing. Ports are clogged with ships that can't move, their cargo tainted by ash or simply unable to reach its destination. Supermarkets in urban areas are being emptied in a frenzy of panic buying, while rural communities are left to fend for themselves. And then there's the water. Ash is contaminating rivers, lakes, and reservoirs, turning clean water into a toxic sludge. Cities are struggling to filter it out, but the sheer volume is overwhelming. Reports are coming in of mass die-offs of fish and other aquatic life, their habitats rendered uninhabitable by the fallout. The humanitarian crisis is growing. Refugee camps are springing up across the country, filled with people who fled the disaster zone with nothing but the clothes on their backs. These camps are overcrowded, underfunded, and ill-equipped to handle the influx of desperate souls. Disease is beginning to spread. Respiratory infections, waterborne illnesses, and the ever-present threat of starvation. Internationally, the situation is no better. The ash cloud is affecting air quality in countries thousands of miles away. Hospitals in Europe are reporting an increase in respiratory problems, particularly among the elderly and those with pre-existing conditions. In Asia, monsoon patterns are being disrupted, leading to catastrophic flooding in some areas and droughts in others. Africa, already struggling with food insecurity, is bracing for the worst as global grain exports dwindle. And what about the oceans? Volcanic eruptions like this one don't just affect the land. The oceans are feeling the impact too. Sulfur dioxide and other gases are dissolving into seawater, acidifying the oceans at an alarming rate. Coral reefs, already under stress from climate change, are facing yet another existential threat. Marine ecosystems are on the brink, and the consequences for global fisheries could be devastating. The economic fallout is staggering. Stock markets around the world are plummeting as businesses shutter, supply chains crumble, and investors panic. The U.S. economy, already strained by the disaster, is teetering on the edge of collapse. Unemployment is skyrocketing as industries reliant on transportation, agriculture, and manufacturing grind to a halt. I've heard from so many of you, calling in to share your stories, your fears, your grief. A truck driver from Ohio told me he hasn't worked in weeks because the roads are impassable. A mother in Texas is worried about how she'll feed her children as grocery store shelves go empty. A teacher in Florida wonders if her school will ever reopen. The personal toll of this disaster is as vast as its physical and economic impacts. And yet, Amid the despair, there are glimmers of hope. Communities are coming together to support one another, sharing resources and sheltering the most vulnerable. Scientists and engineers are working tirelessly to develop new technologies to mitigate the disaster's effects. Governments are coordinating international aid efforts, though progress is slow and often mired in bureaucracy. For now, all we can do is endure. The world has changed, perhaps irreversibly, and we must find a way to adapt. I'll be here, bringing you the stories, the updates, the voices of those who refuse to give up. This is Martin Drake, your guide through the darkness, reminding you that even in the face of unimaginable horror, humanity has a way of persevering. Stay safe, stay strong, and hold on to hope. We're in this together. This is Martin Drake, broadcasting from what feels like the end of an era, a twilight age where the world we knew has vanished beneath a cold, gray shroud. The sun is hidden, cloaked by the volcanic ash that continues to spiral through the atmosphere. It's as though Yellowstone's wrath has stolen the warmth from the earth itself, and in its place, it has left a world of unrelenting cold, a long, harrowing winter that shows no signs of yielding. Tonight, I want to share with you what this winter means for all of us and how it's carving itself into our lives, our hearts, and even our very souls. The scientists warned us about this. Volcanic winter, they call it. It sounds almost poetic, doesn't it? But there's no poetry in this relentless cold. It's as if the earth has stopped breathing, its warmth stolen by the veil of ash and sulfur that now stretches across the sky. The sun barely peeks through, a pale anemic disk casting weak light that feels more like an afterthought than a source of life. Temperatures have plummeted globally, and regions unaccustomed to harsh winters are finding themselves in the grip of a cold they're not prepared for. The Midwest, already struggling under layers of ash, is now locked in ice. Temperatures in Kansas and Nebraska have dropped to record lows, freezing what remains of their ash-blanketed landscapes. The Great Plains look like an apocalyptic tundra, fields once golden with wheat now desolate and gray, draped in frost. The winds howl across the open land, carrying with them the sting of both cold and despair. In the South, where winters are usually mild, the cold has been a shock. Texans are reporting frozen pipes, collapsing power grids, and a scarcity of heating supplies. Families huddle together for warmth, burning anything they can find to keep the frost from creeping into their bones. One woman from Houston called in earlier tonight. She was crying as she told me how she and her husband had taken their children into the garage to burn old furniture in a makeshift fire pit. "We don't have a choice," she said. "We're doing whatever we can to keep them alive." The East Coast isn't faring much better. New York City has been paralyzed by a brutal frost that's turned its iconic skyline into a frozen ghost town. Snow and ash combine to form a gray sludge that clogs streets and buries cars. The city's heating systems are failing under the strain, and shelters are overflowing with people seeking refuge from the cold. I received a report earlier that Central Park is now a sprawling encampment of tents and makeshift shelters, a haunting reminder of the city's vulnerability. Even the West Coast, typically buffered by its temperate climate, isn't immune. California's vineyards and orchards are freezing over, their fragile crops destroyed by the unexpected frost. Power outages are widespread as the state's infrastructure struggles to cope with the sudden demand for heat. And all along the coast, the Pacific Ocean churns ominously, its waters growing colder and its marine life suffering the consequences. And yet, this isn't just an American tragedy. The cold knows no borders. Europe is experiencing its harshest winter in centuries, with snowfall burying cities like London, Paris, and Berlin. In Asia, monsoons have been disrupted, leading to flooding in some areas and droughts in others. India's northern regions are seeing unprecedented snowfall, while further south, farmers are lamenting the loss of their crops to unseasonable frost. The long winter is having catastrophic effects on agriculture worldwide. Crops can't grow without sunlight, and what little remains in storage is rapidly depleting. Famine is becoming a grim reality for millions, and aid organizations are stretched beyond their limits. I spoke with a relief worker earlier today, a woman stationed in a refugee camp in Ethiopia. She described scenes of desperation, children with hollow eyes, mothers begging for food, fathers weeping as they watch their families starve. But famine isn't the only threat. The cold is bringing with it a host of other dangers. Disease is spreading rapidly in overcrowded shelters and camps where people huddle together for warmth. Respiratory infections are rampant, exacerbated by the ash-laden air that continues to irritate lungs and weaken immune systems. Hospitals are overwhelmed, their resources dwindling as quickly as the temperatures. I wish I could tell you that there's an end in sight, but the reality is far bleaker. Scientists estimate that this volcanic winter could last for years, possibly even a decade, before the atmosphere begins to clear and the Earth starts to warm again. That's the best case scenario. The worst, well, let's just say it's not something I'm ready to contemplate tonight. For now, we're left to adapt to this new reality. Communities are finding ways to survive, though survival often comes at a cost. People are scavenging for food, breaking into abandoned homes and stores in search of anything edible. Bartering has become the new economy, with items like blankets, firewood, and canned goods more valuable than gold. I've been doing my best to help where I can, broadcasting information about relief efforts, emergency shelters, and survival tips. But even here in my bunker, the cold is creeping in. My generator is running low on fuel, and the heaters are struggling to keep up. I can see my breath as I speak to you, and my fingers feel like ice against the microphone. But I won't stop. I can't. This broadcast is my lifeline, and I hope it's yours too. Together we'll face this long winter, one night at a time. This is Martin Drake, signing off for now. Stay warm, stay safe, and remember, you're not alone. Not as long as this voice reaches you in the dark. Good evening, listeners. This is Martin Drake, speaking to you from the cold, desolate shell of what was once our thriving world. Tonight, as the winds howl and the frost tightens its grip, I'm here to remind you of something that neither this long winter nor the wrath of Yellowstone can take from us: our resilience. Humanity, for all its flaws, has always had a stubborn streak, a refusal to yield even when the odds seem insurmountable. Tonight, let's talk about that resilience, about the courage and ingenuity that's beginning to flicker like firelight in this endless cold. Weeks have turned into months, and the world as we knew it has vanished beneath layers of ash and ice. Yet against all odds, people are finding ways to survive. Communities are forming, bound not by geography, but by shared determination. In this frozen wasteland, humanity is proving that it can adapt, even to a world as hostile as this one. Take the town of Cody, Wyoming. Nestled just outside the Yellowstone blast zone, it was among the first places to feel the eruption's fury. At first, the survivors were scattered, their homes buried beneath ash, and their spirits crushed by the sheer scale of the devastation. But something extraordinary began to happen. Strangers became neighbors, neighbors became family, and together, they began to rebuild. Using what little resources they could salvage, the people of Cody have transformed their high school gymnasium into a communal shelter. They've rigged up wood-burning stoves to provide heat, using scraps of furniture and fallen trees for fuel. A group of engineers managed to restore a portion of the town's power grid, enough to keep a few lights flickering and a makeshift water pump running. And every evening, they gather around a single radio. My voice, they tell me, their connection to the wider world. But it's not just small towns like Cody. Across the country, people are finding ways to endure. In Chicago, a group of scientists and engineers has repurposed an abandoned subway station into an underground refuge. tunnels, insulated by layers of earth and concrete, offer some protection from the cold, and the scientists have managed to grow crops using hydroponic systems and artificial light. It's not much, just lettuce, herbs, and a few root vegetables, but it's a start. In Florida, where the ashfall is lighter but the cold just as biting, fishermen have turned to the sea for sustenance. They've rigged up old fishing boats with makeshift heaters and are braving the icy waters to catch what they can. It's dangerous work, storms are frequent, and the fish are becoming scarce, but it's keeping their communities alive. Then there's the story of a woman named Sarah, a nurse from Denver. When the hospitals in her city became overwhelmed, Sarah didn't give up. Instead, she gathered a group of like-minded individuals and set up a field clinic in an abandoned warehouse. Using whatever supplies they could scavenge, they've been treating frostbite, respiratory infections, and even childbirth. Sarah called into the station last night. She sounded exhausted, her voice rough from the cold, but there was a spark of determination in her words. "We're not just surviving," she said. "We're fighting for each other." Even here in my bunker, I've seen evidence of humanity's resilience. People are calling in, sharing their stories of survival and hope. One man from Pennsylvania described how his neighborhood had come together to build a communal greenhouse, using salvaged glass and plastic to trap what little warmth the sun provides. A woman from Oregon told me about her group's efforts to clear ash from local waterways, ensuring a steady supply of fresh water. But resilience isn't just about physical survival. It's about holding on to the things that make us human. Music, art, and stories are finding their way into the cold, dark corners of this new world. In Cody, children are painting murals on the gymnasium walls, their bright colors a stark contrast to the gray world outside. In Chicago's subway refuge, a violinist plays each evening, her melodies echoing through the tunnels. And here on this broadcast, I'm doing my best to keep the stories alive, to remind you all that we're more than just survivors. Of course, resilience doesn't come without cost. The struggle to adapt is leaving scars, both visible and invisible. People are losing loved ones to the cold, to hunger, to disease. The weight of these losses is heavy, and some days it feels unbearable. I've spoken to listeners who've told me they're on the brink of giving up, their spirits crushed by the enormity of what we're facing. But even in these moments of despair, there are glimmers of hope. One listener from Minnesota called in to tell me about her daughter, a teenager who's been teaching herself to sew using scraps of fabric and an old hand-crank sewing machine. She's been making coats, scarves, and mittens for her neighbors, her small acts of kindness warming more than just bodies. And then there's the ingenuity, the way people are using what they have to solve problems. A farmer in Iowa rigged up a wind turbine to power a small heating system in his barn, keeping his livestock alive through the cold. A group of college students in Arizona has been experimenting with ways to filter ash from the air, using designs they've cobbled together from old textbooks and online forums. As I sit here in my bunker, the cold seeping in despite my best efforts to keep it at bay, I can't help but feel a strange sense of pride in what we're capable of. Humanity is resilient. We're stubborn, resourceful, and above all, determined. We're finding ways to survive in a world that seems intent on erasing us, and in doing so, we're proving that even in the darkest of winters, the human spirit endures. This is Martin Drake signing off for tonight. Stay strong, my friends. Stay hopeful. And remember, we're in this together. One night, one breath, one heartbeat at a time. Good evening, listeners. This is Martin Drake, your voice in the cold, the one who's been here with you through this unimaginable ordeal. Tonight, we take a moment to reflect, not on what we've lost, but on what we've gained. We stand on the precipice of a new world, a world born from the ashes of the old one. But we're not done yet. As we face the long road ahead, the road of recovery, I want you to remember this. Resilience is not a singular event. It's an ongoing fight, a commitment to rebuild, to find meaning even in the aftermath of devastation. It's not easy. It's never been easy. But here we are, and here we'll stay. Recovery. It's a word that feels strange after everything we've witnessed. The countless lives lost, the cities erased, the earth itself scarred beyond recognition. It's a word that carries weight, that demands something from us. And yet, as strange as it might sound, I can feel the first flickers of it. Recovery, not in grand gestures, but in the small things. In the people who still get up each day, who face the relentless cold with nothing but their will to survive. In the weeks since Yellowstone's eruption, the world has changed in ways we never thought possible. It feels as though time itself has been altered, stretched thin beneath the pressure of a planet holding its breath. The ash cloud still lingers, the atmosphere thick with the remnants of the explosion. The sun remains an occasional ghost, hidden behind the smothering blanket of debris. But slowly, so slowly that it's easy to miss, things are shifting. People are adjusting. We are adapting. Take the story of Portland, Oregon, for example. A city once known for its lush greenery and vibrant arts scene is now a quiet shadow of its former self. The streets are dark, the air cold, and the trees that once lined the avenues are now bare, their leaves long since consumed by ash. But despite the devastation, something remarkable is happening there. Small businesses, once scattered and isolated, have begun to band together, sharing resources, tools, and skills. One of the local tech startups, despite its infrastructure being destroyed, has managed to keep a small portion of its operations running using solar panels salvaged from rooftops. They're working on developing sustainable energy solutions to keep the city's lights flickering, even in these dark times. And it's not just the urban areas that are beginning to show signs of recovery. Across the countryside, farms that once seemed doomed are showing resilience in ways we never thought possible. In Nebraska, a group of agricultural experts has been working with farmers to test new crop variants, hardy frost-resistant plants that might be able to thrive in the altered climate. It's a delicate experiment and the risks are high. But in the small successes, there's hope. They've harvested the first batch of barley, barely enough to feed the surrounding communities, but enough to prove that it's possible to grow in this new, hostile world. In Alaska, communities that were initially cut off from the rest of the world have begun to rebuild their infrastructure. Using old military technology, they've managed to get airstrips back into operation, allowing for limited shipments of supplies. They've built makeshift greenhouses out of old plastic tarps and metal frames, growing what vegetables they can. It's a slow process, but the people of Alaska are used to endurance. They've lived through long winters before. Now, they live through the longest one of all. Meanwhile, in the heart of what was once the Yellowstone caldera, the land itself is beginning to change. The once scorched earth is slowly being reclaimed by nature. Despite the massive devastation, small plants and shrubs are beginning to push their way through the cracked, ash-covered surface. The soil is still poisoned, still unable to support large-scale life, but there's something beautiful in that tenacity. The earth, like humanity, will not be easily silenced. It's a slow recovery, but the land is breathing again. And so too are we. I've heard from many of you listeners about your struggles and your triumphs. Some of you have told me that you found solace in the quiet moments, sitting with your families, taking the time to appreciate the simple things, like a cup of warm tea or the crackle of a fire. Others have shared how they've found new purpose, using their skills to help those around them. One man, a former truck driver, told me how he's been hauling supplies to nearby shelters, risking the treacherous roads for the chance to make a difference. But it hasn't been easy, not by a long shot. We're all still reeling from the emotional weight of what we've lost. Some are beginning to talk about the loved ones they've lost, the communities that are no more, the places that no longer exist. That grief, that deep, crushing grief has settled into our bones. There are nights when I hear from listeners who are on the edge, their voices raw with emotion. They talk about the endless darkness, the way it presses in on them, and how, some days, it feels like it will swallow them whole. But here's what I've learned, what I want you to know. Grief is not the end, it's the beginning. We grieve because we loved, and love, in whatever form it takes, is always the seed from which recovery grows. In this strange new world, we're beginning to find a new rhythm. The daily routines that once seemed mundane, cooking, cleaning, working, have taken on new significance. I've heard from so many of you who are working together, pooling your resources to ensure that everyone has enough. I've heard stories of people coming together to share their skills, whether it's teaching one another how to repair broken machinery, or how to mend clothes, or how to grow food from scraps. There's a quiet beauty in these moments of cooperation, a recognition that in the end, we're all in this together. And then there's the next challenge we face, the rebuilding of our society. In the chaos of the eruption, the breakdown of the old systems was inevitable. Governments, corporations, even local leaders, they all faltered under the weight of the catastrophe. But slowly, new systems are emerging, new forms of governance, new ways of connecting, new ways of ensuring that everyone has a voice. These new leaders, some of them known, some of them emerging from the ashes, are working tirelessly to bring order to the chaos. They're not perfect, but they are determined, and that for now is enough. The recovery is still in its infancy, and the road ahead is long and uncertain. We've only just begun to rebuild what was lost, but we've already seen that we are capable of more than we ever realized. We are capable of resilience, of adaptation, of hope. Tonight, I want to leave you with this thought. We will never be the same. We can't be. The world we knew is gone, and in its place is something raw, something unrecognizable. But within that, there is a chance, an opportunity to create something new. So hold on. Hold on to the things that matter, hold on to each other, and hold on to the belief that no matter what the future holds, we will survive. Together. This is Martin Drake, signing off for tonight. Stay strong, stay safe, and above all, stay human.